Do you ever find that your napkin images look a little plain on a white background? If you're feeling a little bit blah about your napkin art, let's talk about amazing and easy techniques to level up your next project. So we're not only going to talk about techniques, but what to do when you make a mistake or feel like your mixed media project is careening out of control.
So to start with this piece, I ended up using that trick that I showed you a few weeks ago on how to get those beautiful fussy cut napkin images where you have all the little details cut out. Because I wanted to play around with the background a little bit, I wanted to make sure I didn't have a lot of this stray pieces of white paper because I wanted to be able to have a very clear and concise background. So to attach this, because the napkin is so thin, I can basically just add my layer of matte medium or whatever collage medium you have on top. And yes, you're going to get a few more wrinkles this way, but what I'm more concerned about, I'm less worried about wrinkles than I am about making sure that I don't get any of this extra matte medium on the background. And you'll see as I go on why I care so much about this. And so just adhering it to the back. And if you haven't ever seen this technique before, check out the description below. I have a video where I go into a lot of depth about how to attach these images, the different ways you can cut them out. And there's a lot of good information there if you've never seen this before. And so I'm just basically working section by section, adding this onto my watercolor background. And I'm moving to a thinner angle brush because what I'm trying to do with this one is I don't want a lot of medium going past where I usually wouldn't care so much because I want to do some specific things to this white background. I'm making sure that I don't have a lot of medium falling in places I don't want it. Along this bottom part here, I'm changing my strategy because I know at least for the first couple inches, I'm going to be using the full napkin. This is just going to help it lay down a little bit better. It's going to give me a little bit more control over the wrinkles. And it's just generally going to give me a much better final result. So before we go adding any other layers on top of this, we need to make sure that everything is really glued down. If any of these little edges or anything are not in place, you want to make sure they're fully glued down with either your Mod Podge or your matte medium, whatever collage medium you're using, just so that you end up with a really good seal, because it's going to make a difference as we go on. So let's talk about what we can do with the background. I'm working with a watercolor paper. So right now I am just wetting the background with my watercolor brush. This is where you can create a really pretty blend, just a wet on wet gradation onto your background. So you could do this before you add in your image, but I think the big thing with this is going to allow you to be able to keep your image as white as possible. And now I can come in and I could look at adding in some different colors. I'm basically going to be using some of my beautiful beam paints that I have here. They're just a beautiful paint. And if you've never heard of beam paints, make sure you check them out. And so I can basically just bring a little bit of color down so that we maybe have a little bit of a darker sky. And then you might notice that if I go over it, it gets a little bit muddy. But then don't worry about it because all you need to do is take a little bit of paper towel or a baby wipe and wipe it off. Because we're working on top of matte medium that has dried, what's nice about that is if you've gotten it sealed down completely, it's not going to stick to your napkin. Instead, what it's going to do is it's going to basically create a resist. Then if you're finding that you're not getting quite the blend you want, just continue to add a little bit more water, blend it down. This is just a simple, super easy idea for how you can create a little bit more variation in that background. And you can see that in any areas I add a lot of matte medium down, it's going to resist some of this watercolor just a touch. So you can leave it there and keep it pretty simple, or you can come with a little bit of pigment powder. I'm using brushes today, so I'm just going to add in a little bit of turquoise pigment powder. So you can see it's even as I've put it down on the wet paper, it's already starting to move. So I'm going to add in a little bit of sea green. And again, that's going to change the background again a little bit, because you can see just how those are blending out. And now if I go in with a little bit of water, these are going to move some more. And that's pretty cool, but maybe that's a bit much for where you wanted to take it. But what's kind of cool about it is you're seeing how things are mixing. But if you don't like how spotted it is, or you want to keep that a little bit brighter, you can always just take your brush and just work it out. Because again, this is a watercolor pigment, so we can play around with it. You can see it's kind of resisting the areas that have the matte medium. What will happen is that the matte medium will seal it in, but you can add a little bit of watercolor to the matte medium and it will work. So it's one of those things of technically it resists, but not always, and you can play around with it and make it do things maybe you had not planned to make it do before. So again, lots of options for where we can take these types of techniques. Watercolor is an interesting thing because it'll often work on surfaces it's not totally meant to work on, which is what makes it amazing. But at the same time, it's also making sure you don't take it too far. Okay, so I learned something new today. I learned that if you do not put the matte medium underneath before you added your image on top, what can happen is that the watercolor paper and that pigment will seep underneath the image and show up. So lesson learned for me. This is the thing, is you always learn something new when you do mixed media. It's not the end of the world because I am not even close to being done with this page, and let's play around with different ways that we can bring these images back. So let's start by fixing these areas that maybe we're not wild about. I'm gonna start in by adding in like a little bit of white. You're just gonna want to take your heavy body white, add a little bit of water to it. You want it a little bit thinner. Without that thinness, it's going to go on way too thick. And you don't want to cover up everything. All you want to do is try to fix maybe what you don't love there. So I'm just adding in a little bit of this white color to these areas that got a little bit obliterated. And you can make the choice whether or not you want it fully covered or you want a little bit of that blue peeking through. It really comes down to your personal preference. But I'm basically just adding it in just to outline those areas, and that's going to bring it back. And so I'm adding in a little bit of the pink to the white. And also add it in there. It's a little bit more red than pink, but we're going to run with the pink a little bit. We can also bring in some of the pink into some of these areas and just even change up the color, because that was another thing I wanted to show you today is, you know, we don't have to leave these exactly the color they came with. We can play around with it and see what we can come up with. And so you can see that it is trying to seep through a little bit. So we're just going to leave that and come back to it. So I'm just going to come in here and do the same thing. Again, try to think of your brush strokes as being the same direction as the flower, just so that it looks a little bit more natural. I'll be honest, I was a little surprised how well, I shouldn't be surprised. The brush has a very strong color. So to be honest, I shouldn't be as surprised as I am that it did try to take over stuff a little bit. And this is where you can come over some of these areas again with a little bit more of those lighter colors and try to fix a few of those areas that took on a color that you're not really wild about. And so already that's looking a lot better. And just make sure you keep watering down that paint. You don't want completely transparent, but you also don't want it opaque because you want to be able to still see what the image underneath it was supposed to be. And so now what I'm getting into is that I'm starting to highlight stuff. So this is where I was going to go with this is, let's say you're finding that you have areas you're like, oh, I wish that was a little bit brighter or a little bit darker. You can always come in with a little bit of paint. Again, very watered down over top, and you can add highlights and darken things a little bit. We're deepening colors, we're highlighting areas, we're changing the color of our napkin. So maybe you have a napkin and you like it, but it doesn't seem like it's really popping on your page. This is a great technique for just adding just a little bit of paint. It brings those colors out a little bit. And again, I'm not playing around with the edges. I'm not playing around with all the definition. But what I am playing around with is a little bit of the darker and lighter colors. This is also where you can play around with a little bit of the Prussian blue, and we can start adding in darker areas. And then you can even use your finger to rub it out. Because the nice thing about the surface is once we've added in the matte medium, it makes these surfaces super strong. But you can see now I'm darkening some of these areas that were generally quite a bit lighter before. I think that just adds us a little bit of something fun to these projects. And again, you'll notice I'm not touching the whole leaf. I'm finding those dark areas and I'm just bringing them out just a little bit more. It's going to create contrast. It's going to create interest. It's just another way of being able to bring something new to your imagery. What I've found is I like being able to play with my imagery. Sometimes images are really nice just on their own, but I love being able to play with them, seeing like, what can I do to just bring a little bit more to the image? What can I do that's going to make this a little bit more contrasting, pop a little bit, be a little bit more interesting? So let's move on and figure out a few different things we can do. So let's say you don't really like that edge we have going on there with all these edges here. You can always come over them with a little bit of watercolor crayon, because that's going to help a little bit. And it's almost like we're just going to create a little bit of a line around the outside, because sometimes it can be nice. It can almost be that halo can almost be a little bit distracting. And it's a lot easier to use a watercolor crayon to do this, You could also use paint, but then I think what you're going to run into is the paint's going to look a little funny as well. So we're going to come in with a size 4 brush, and it has to be wet, and now we're going to add in our color there. And you can see now that's covering that up a lot better than it was, right? And now I'm going to mix that out.
Okay, so at this point, I really should have stopped fussing with a halo. I shouldn't have tried to fix the halo around the image. I knew when I applied the napkin that the medium was going to go past the edges and would create a little bit of resist to the watercolor paint. I should have created an even halo around the entire image and just ran with it. But by continuing to mess with it and try to fix it, I feel like I made things a little bit worse.
So one thing we can do to bring back some of these highlights is we can come back to our watercolors. I have here, and get another one of the Beam Paints one. This is a really nice metallic color. And it's going to be hard to see as I apply it. But what's nice about it is once these surfaces are dry, you can add metallic color to all over these surfaces. And that's just another way of creating a little bit of shine. It's going to be subtle, but you're going to be able to see it. And I tend to do this on a lot of my napkins just because I find that it just helps the color shine through. It just makes them that little bit brighter. It makes them a little bit nicer. And being able to accent some of those highlighted edges just brings in like another nice look to this project. So yeah, my stone ground, my Beam Paints for metallic colors are my go-to ones. I just find the colors just so nice. And then you end up getting just really vivid mica. And it just looks fabulous. You don't want them on every leaf. You just want to add them in little places. Just to help the shine come through. And this is where you can go quite wild with this. It kind of depends on where you want to go. I always overdo it. I can't help myself, you know, but at the same time, like I love it because it just has such a nice little bit of shine onto your project. And like that's already looking so much better. So let's figure out something really cool for creating way more contrast. And that's a Stabilo all pencil. Writes on paper, glass, plastic, and metal. So what's neat about this one is you can come in and just add in some dark areas onto your page. And that can be it. You could just be like, well, I want that a little bit darker. I want a little bit more shadow here. Let's add in something down here. But then also what you can do with it is, let's say you're like, well, I'd really like to have a little bit more definition. You're like, well, that's going down kind of chunky, right? But we're not done yet. Come with a watercolor brush, and you can see how dark you can make that area. And let's say you're like, wow, that's way more than I planned to do. Like, that's just way too much. Not a problem. Grab a paper towel, dab and lift, and we can bring out a bunch of that color. But then we can come back in and go, okay, well, that was a little too far, but let's try to create some level of shadow in here. So a little bit of this goes a long way. So it's something to be aware of just as you use it. Just that you don't go too far with it. But what's nice about it, it's a great way of outlining and being able to add in a little bit of deepness into some of these areas. And especially if it's wet, you're going to get a much smoother look to it. But this is also where you can just do it along the edges, and because it'll work on any sort of paper, you can use it to just define things more. You don't even need to wet it. I'm pretty happy with this. I'm not loving the way that I ended up going over it with the matte medium and with some of the crayon. It's not the most seamless technique there. I wish it was a little more seamless when I had done it. So what I'm going to do is add in a little bit of texture. So using some Gloss Super Heavy Gel and a stencil, we are going to play with this and see what we can do. I'm using Super Heavy Gel just so that, because I'm using a large stencil, this is going to keep it tidier. I'm trying to get some of the foliage around it, but some of these main succulents I'm trying to generally avoid. But I'll get just the edges of them. And I'm trying to put a thick layer. I'm trying not to overwork it too much. This one's a very open stencil, and sometimes the open stencils can be a little challenging, so we'll see how tidy I end up making this. Plus, I'm using a slightly older gel. So one thing, if you're buying a lot of these gels, make sure that you use them in a couple years because they start getting a little bit gritty. They get a little bit grainy. They're not nearly as nice to use a couple years later. So I tend to try to buy in smaller amounts and use up what I can. And so, yeah, we're just going to go over this whole area here. those flowers. And this is just going to change the look of it. And then once this is dry, we're going to play around with it some more and see what else we can do to just add in those final touches to this project. And you can see that because I had a watercolor background, the blue is starting to show through. So another thing to be aware of. So that might seem like a lot, but it's going to dry clear. And we're just going to do one more little section there. It's nice when you can have a stencil that covers the whole thing. But in this case, this one's a little bit short. But I wanted to use something that was quite large because this is going to show you how much of it you can cover and still have it look really good once you're done. So because I ended up putting on the gel medium a little thicker than I originally planned, I ended up having to leave it to dry overnight. So you'll know it's dry when there's no cloudy areas left. If you see any cloudy areas, it means that it's dry on the surface, but not dry underneath. And for the sake of this video, I want to make sure that it was fully dry before adding anything else on. So a couple things to realize. When I added the gel medium, I didn't think about the fact that I was going to wet all of that Stabilo all pencil. So you can see where I had maybe slightly lighter lines, they've now gotten darker, but they did not smear, which is a beautiful thing. And so generally I got a really nice and clear look from this. And this just creates a little bit more interest between the foreground and the background, and makes it a little bit more interesting and a little bit more dynamic. But as I've said before, I should have maybe just left that halo, left things a little bit more, because now I've run into the fact that I had a little bit more gradation between the sky and here, and now it's a little bit more all one color, but that's okay. We're just going to work on it a little bit further. So from here, we do have some different options. I'm going to start playing around with a little bit of these waxes. So I have a few different colors. I have some of the Sizzix Luster Wax, the Art Alchemy ones. I also have these other Art Alchemy ones as well. So I have like greens, blues, some brushed iron, some bronzed age, but I might actually stick with this one here because it's a little bit lighter. So we're going to give it a try and see, because you can see it has a little bit of luminescence, but it is pretty transparent and it's a little bit purple. So we can add that onto our surface and we can look at trying to catch some of the edges. And we don't have to do this everywhere. We can just do it in small places, but you can see that's going to create an interesting resist to our background. It doesn't really blend with the watercolor because it is a wax. So it's going to give a very different look to this. So it's going to not really stick onto the gloss medium itself. It's only going to stick into the cracks in between it, because that's the watercolor paper where it's going to have a chance to grab and just add a little bit of texture to that. This is going to work the best when on a slightly darker surface where you're starting to see a little bit of contrast. So if I added this on black, this would be amazing. And again, if you didn't love this, the other option is going to come with a baby wipe, remove some of the color, it's going to come off. But then you might end up pulling up a little bit of the watercolor. So just make sure this is the direction you want to go before adding too much on, because it's meant to stay a little bit more than some of the other things that I've shown you today. These pages kind of come back and forth. You end up playing around, and this is about experimentation. So if you're feeling like, well, you've really gone a long way with this, yes, on purpose. Because I think sometimes we tend to be a little timid with our mixed media work, and that's what the art journal for. It's a laboratory. It's a place to play. It just doesn't end up on a wall. This ends up in my book. If I go, wow, I really didn't love that page, I can either paint over it or I can just see it as a learning lesson. And that's the important thing about art, I think, is sometimes we get so caught up on the final destination that we don't look at what we learned in the process. I've been developing some different stuff for our classes this fall, and I've been finding that I've had moments of, wow, that didn't work. Wow, that didn't work. And sometimes you're like, okay, I'm 6 hours in. I know everything that doesn't work and I haven't figured out something that does. And that's okay, because you know what? Sometimes we need to have these moments, and I keep trying to put in the perspective of, well, I've learned what doesn't work. I've figured out something that isn't successful, but that's okay. That means that maybe the next thing I try is going to be successful. If you ever see these waxes and you don't know how to use them, there's lots of really interesting ways you can use them on projects. And if that's something you're interested to see more of, let me know. If you leave a comment below, I will look to do a video sometime in the future with it. So this is as far as I'm going today, but there's lots of places you can go with this. You could add in a paint pen instead of using the Stabilo all pencil. You could play around with using colored pencils on this. The nice thing about the matte medium is because it will allow you to add other mediums on top. because of the rough nature of it. So that like opens up a lot of other creative possibilities. But today I'm just going to finish with just adding in a little quote chip. I think this one was from Ranger. I think it was a Tim Holtz one. I bought these a while back, so I will try to link to them below just so that if you're looking for something like this to use in your next project, then at least you know where I was able to find them. And again, all of the supplies I use, you can find in the description below. Make sure that you check those out. They are affiliate links, which means that anytime you buy something from one of those links, I do get a small commission, but no additional cost to you. And that's just a way you can really support this channel. So thank you again so much for your support. And so where do I want to put this? And I think I can put this over here because I love these little group of guys and I don't want to really mess with that. So today is full of possibilities. That is my word for today. I think that's a good one. That's a good reminder, I think, for all of us. We may feel like we're maybe in a bit of a rut, or we're feeling we're not being very creative, or there's other things in life that are kind of getting in the way. But just realize every day is full of possibilities. Every day is full of things to be grateful for. And that's just a little reminder to myself to just keep focusing on the good. So I hope you've enjoyed this project. I'd love for you to check out some of my other napkin videos. You can click here to see the playlist, and you can click here for a video that's specifically about how to do the fussy cut. So I hope I'll see you in one of those next videos.